The coins scattered across the counter as Frank Williams counted them for the third time, his weathered hands trembling slightly. 53 cents. That's all he had left until his pension check arrived next week. The cashier waited patiently while other customers shifted uncomfortably behind him. Among them stood Muhammad Ali, watching quietly as a man who had given everything for his country struggled to afford a loaf of bread and a can of soup. If this story of unexpected grace and mutual understanding moves you, hit that subscribe button and share in the comments a time when someone changed your perspective about courage. Your story might inspire others today. It was a cold February evening in 1971 when Muhammad Ali walked into Murphy's Grocery on Chicago's South Side. He had just finished training at the gym and needed a few things before heading home. Ali was in a strange place in his life. His boxing license had been restored just months earlier after being stripped for refusing military induction. America was still deeply divided about the Vietnam War, and opinions about Ali were equally split. To some, he was a principled man who stood by his beliefs. To others, he remained a draft dodger who had betrayed his country. The small neighborhood store was one of the few places where Ali could shop without being constantly approached by fans or critics. The elderly owner, Mrs. Murphy, had always treated him with quiet respect, and the regular customers generally minded their own business. Tonight felt different, though. As Ali moved through the narrow aisles picking up milk, bread, and a few other items, he noticed the tension in the air. At the checkout counter, a man in his early 50s was methodically counting coins. Frank Williams wore a faded army jacket over a clean but worn shirt. His left sleeve was pinned up where his arm ended just below the shoulder. A small Korean War veteran's pin was fastened to his chest, and his face bore the weathered look of someone who had seen too much but endured it with dignity. Behind Frank, 3 other customers waited in line. A middle-aged woman whispered to her husband, "That's Muhammad Ali back there." The husband turned to look, his expression hardening. "Draft dodger," he muttered, not caring if Ali heard. "Real heroes are right in front of us," he added, nodding toward Frank. Ali said nothing, but his jaw tightened slightly. He had grown accustomed to such comments over the years, but they never stopped stinging. He watched as Frank carefully separated his coins, pennies, nickels, dimes, making small piles on the counter. "247, Frank said to the cashier, a young woman named Betty who had been working there for 6 months. She had rung up a small loaf of bread, a can of soup, and a carton of milk. Basic necessities, nothing more. Frank continued counting. $2.33. He recounted, hoping he had made an error. The same amount. He was 14 cents short. "I'm sorry," Frank said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of a man's pride being tested. "I'll have to put something back." Betty looked at the meager items and then at Frank's face. She had seen this before. Veterans stretching every penny until their next check arrived. "Don't worry about it, Mr. Williams. 14 cents isn't—" "No," Frank said firmly, cutting her off. "I pay my own way. I don't take charity." He reached for the milk carton. "I don't really need this." The woman behind him clicked her tongue impatiently. "Some people just take forever," she said loudly. Her husband nodded in agreement, then looked pointedly at Ali. "At least some people served their country and earned the right to take their time." The comment hung in the air like smoke. Frank turned slightly, noticing Ali for the first time. Recognition flickered across his face, followed by something else. Disapproval, perhaps even disgust. He had lost his arm at Porkchop Hill in Korea, watching friends die while fighting for American freedom. The man behind him had refused to fight when his country called. Ali felt the weight of every eye in the store. This was the moment everyone expected him to respond, to defend himself, to argue about his beliefs and his right to conscientious objection. Instead, he did something no one anticipated. He stepped forward and gently placed his hand on Betty's arm. When she looked at him, he shook his head slightly and mouthed silently, "I'll handle it." "Excuse me," Ali said to Frank, his voice soft and respectful. "Sir, I couldn't help but notice your pin. You served in Korea?" Frank's shoulders stiffened. He turned to face Ali fully, his eyes filled with years of pain and loss. "Yes, I served. I served when my country called, unlike some people." The silence in the store was absolute. The other customers held their breath, waiting for Ali to explode, to argue, to defend himself with the sharp wit and cutting words he was famous for. This was the Muhammad Ali they expected, the man who called himself the greatest, who had taunted opponents and traded verbal barbs with reporters. They waited for the verbal knockout punch, the clever comeback that would put this veteran in his place. Betty gripped the counter, uncertain whether she should call for help or simply witness what promised to be an uncomfortable confrontation. Instead, Ali's expression softened completely. The defensive posture melted away, replaced by something entirely unexpected: genuine curiosity and respect. When he spoke, his voice carried none of the theatrical bravado that had made him famous. "What unit?" he asked quietly, his tone gentle and sincere. Frank seemed taken aback by the question. He had expected anger, defensiveness, perhaps a political speech. He hadn't expected genuine interest. "First Battalion, 31st Infantry," he said slowly. "Pork Chop Hill?" Ali asked, recognizing the unit's involvement in one of the war's bloodiest battles. Frank's eyes widened slightly. "You know about that?" "I know it was hell," Ali said simply. "I know a lot of good men died there. I know you and your brothers faced impossible odds and still did your duty." For a moment, Frank said nothing. The recognition that Ali knew about his service, that he understood what Pork Chop Hill meant, seemed to catch him off guard. "We lost a lot of men," Frank said finally, his voice softer now. "Good men. Better men than me." "No," Ali said firmly. "Not better. Different maybe, but not better. You were there. You faced it. You came home carrying their memory." While they spoke, Ali had quietly moved to stand beside Betty at the register. Without Frank noticing, he had slipped her a $20 bill and whispered, "Ring up his groceries and add whatever a man needs for a week. Keep the change for the next person who comes up short." Betty understood immediately. She had heard stories about Ali's quiet generosity, small acts of kindness that never made the newspapers. "Mr. Williams," Betty said, interrupting the conversation, "I just remembered we're running a special today. Veterans get 10% off, and there's a promotion on the milk. Let me recalculate your total." She made a show of adding things up again. "With the discounts, your total is actually $2.20. You've got 13 cents coming back." Frank looked at her suspiciously. "Since when do you have a veteran's discount?" "Since today," Betty said firmly, looking him directly in the eye. "It's the right thing to do." Frank accepted the change slowly, still seeming uncertain but unwilling to question this small piece of good fortune. As he gathered his groceries, Ali spoke again. "Sir, can I ask you something?" Ali said. "When you were in Korea, what kept you going? What made you fight?" Frank paused, considering the question seriously. "I fought for the man next to me," he said finally, "and I fought so people back home could live free, could make their own choices, even if I didn't agree with them." Ali nodded slowly. "That's exactly what I thought you'd say, and that's exactly why I couldn't go to Vietnam." Frank's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "You fought for freedom," Ali said, his voice gaining strength and conviction. "You fought for the right of Americans to live according to their conscience. When I refused to go to Vietnam, I was exercising the freedom you bled for, the freedom to say this war is wrong without being thrown in prison. You fought so Americans could have the right to disagree with their government, even when that disagreement was unpopular." He paused, letting his words sink in. The grocery store had become an unlikely classroom, with Ali as both student and teacher. "Don't you see, Mr. Williams? Your sacrifice in Korea made my choice in America possible. You didn't fight for blind obedience. You fought for the freedom to think, to choose, to follow our conscience." The store remained silent, every customer riveted by this unexpected conversation. "But I wasn't a coward," Ali continued, his voice gaining strength. "I gave up 3.5 years of my prime career. I gave up millions of dollars. I risked 5 years in prison. I became the most hated man in America. Not because I was afraid to fight, but because I was afraid to fight the wrong war for the wrong reasons." Frank's grip on his groceries tightened. "My friends died for this country, and I honor their sacrifice," Ali said immediately. "But wouldn't their sacrifice be meaningless if we didn't have the right to disagree with our government? If we couldn't say this is wrong when we believe it's wrong? For a long moment, Frank studied Ali's face. He saw no arrogance there, no smugness, none of the braggadocio that Ali was famous for. He saw only sincerity and respect. "You really believe that?" Frank asked. "I believe there are different ways to serve your country," Ali said. "You served with your weapon. I served with my voice. You risked your life for freedom. I risked my career for conscience. Both take courage, just different kinds." Frank was quiet for nearly a minute, thinking deeply about words that challenged everything he had believed about patriotism and service. The other customers waited in respectful silence, sensing they were witnessing something important. A moment when two different definitions of American courage were finding common ground. The grocery store had become a sacred space where understanding was slowly replacing hatred. "I've hated you for years," Frank said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "Hated everything you represented. Hated that you got to stay home safe while boys died in Vietnam. I'd see your name in the papers, see your picture on TV, and I'd think, there's the coward who let others fight his battles. I've been carrying that anger like a stone in my chest." He shifted his weight, the phantom pain in his missing arm flaring as it always did when he was under stress. "But standing here, listening to you talk about my service with respect, hearing you explain your choice without making excuses, I'm wondering if maybe I was wrong about what courage looks like." "Mr. Williams," Ali said softly, "that anger you've been carrying, it comes from love. Love for your fellow soldiers, love for your country, love for the ideals you fought to protect. I've never been angry at you or other veterans for hating me. How could I be? You earned the right to your feelings through blood and sacrifice." He shifted his groceries to his good arm and extended his hand to Ali. "Frank Williams." Ali took the hand gently. "Muhammad Ali. And Mr. Williams, thank you for your service. Thank you for fighting for the freedom that let me make my choice, even when it made people like you hate me." Frank's eyes filled with tears. "I don't hate you anymore," he said quietly. "I may not agree with everything you did, but I can respect a man who stands by his principles, especially when it costs him everything." As Frank turned to leave, the middle-aged woman who had been complaining stepped forward. She had tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry," she said to Ali. "I didn't understand. I thought you were just a coward, but listening to you two talk, I see it differently now." Her husband, who had made the earlier comment about draft dodgers, nodded slowly. "Takes guts to stand alone against the whole country," he admitted. "Maybe we were wrong about you." After Frank left, Ali finished his shopping in thoughtful silence. Betty rang up his items, including the extra groceries she had added to Frank's bill. "That was beautiful," she said quietly. "What you did for him, and the way you talked to him. You changed his mind about you." "He changed my mind too," Ali said. "He reminded me why I made the choice I did. Men like him fought for the freedom I used. I owe him a debt I can never repay." As Ali walked toward the door, Betty called out, "Mr. Ali, that man, Mr. Williams, he comes in here every week. Same thing every time. Just enough food to get by until his next check. He's too proud to accept help." Ali turned back. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying maybe there's a way to help him keep his pride while making sure he eats decent meals." Ali thought for a moment, then pulled out his wallet. He handed Betty $50. "Set up an account. Tell him the store started a special veterans program, discounts, promotions, whatever makes sense. Make sure it lasts." 3 weeks later, Frank Williams returned to Murphy's Grocery. As Betty rang up his purchases, she mentioned the new veterans program the store had started. Frank looked skeptical at first, but when she explained that a generous benefactor had donated money specifically to help veterans, he accepted it with dignity. "Whoever it is," Frank said, "I'd like to thank them." "I think they know," Betty said with a smile. Frank never learned that Muhammad Ali was funding his groceries, and Ali never sought recognition for his generosity. But the conversation between the two men had ripple effects neither could have imagined. Frank began telling other veterans about his encounter with Ali, sharing a different perspective on courage and service. Some still disagreed with Ali's stance on Vietnam, but they began to see him as a man of principle rather than a coward. When Ali's comeback fight against Joe Frazier was announced, Frank Williams bought a ticket. Not because he had become a boxing fan, but because he wanted to support a man who had shown him respect and understanding when he could have easily dismissed him. Years later, when Ali was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, Frank was among the veterans who sent letters of support. In his letter, he wrote, "You taught me that courage isn't just about facing bullets. Sometimes it's about facing your whole country and saying, 'This is wrong.' Sometimes it's about listening to someone who hates you and responding with respect instead of anger. That takes a special kind of bravery." The story of Ali and Frank Williams spread quietly through Chicago's South Side, not as gossip but as inspiration. It became a reminder that understanding could bridge even the deepest divides, that respect could overcome hatred, and that courage came in many forms. The neighborhood barber would tell the story to his customers, teachers would share it with their students, pastors would reference it in their sermons about forgiveness and understanding. Betty kept working at Murphy's Grocery for 30 more years. She never forgot the evening when two men from completely different worlds found common ground in mutual respect. The register where she had witnessed their extraordinary conversation became, in her mind, a sacred place where hearts had been changed through quiet, respectful conversation rather than loud argument. When reporters would occasionally ask her about Ali's character, she would tell them about the February night when he chose understanding over argument, generosity over pride, and changed a veteran's heart with nothing more than genuine respect and quiet kindness. The coins that Frank Williams counted that evening represented far more than money. They represented a man's dignity, his independence, his refusal to accept charity. Ali understood that completely, respected it, and found a way to help without diminishing it. In doing so, he proved that real true strength isn't about winning arguments or defending yourself against critics. It's about seeing the humanity in those who oppose you and responding with grace and compassion instead of anger. Sometimes the greatest victory is not defeating your enemy, but transforming them into a friend through the simple yet deeply profound power of respect and understanding.